For this lesson, I'm using a 02 pen from Sakura. We're going to start with drawing a vertical line upwards. And if you've watched any of my tutorials, you'll know when I'm starting out with pen, I'm drawing a really light dotted lines, almost dotting in the shape of the object before I kind of commit to the permanent lines with pen. I'm curving that line to the right of my paper. This is going to be the kind of the skeleton of the waterfall itself. And you'll see that I'm bringing the line downwards on the right hand side with some more jagged, sharp edges. It's going to be the side of the waterfall, the rocky kind of vertical section that we see before the waterfall itself. It's kind of hiding from view one side of the waterfall. You can now, when I continue the line down to the left, I'm effectively drawing the side of the riverbank that's kind of leading towards us, creating an illusion of three-dimensionality. But then adding texture to the rocks is where this lesson, I think, really becomes fun. When we view rocks, we often see how they're shaded on certain angles and certain sides. Often these angles and sides are not rounded, meaning that there's clearly different faces of the rock that might be in shadow. We're going to focus on using hatching to shade in the bottom side of some of these faces. And you can see that I'm doing this kind of fairly randomly on the left-hand side of our waterfall. I'm drawing a line and then adding some hatching and with some dark shading to kind of give each rock a little bit of perspective and make it seem like each one is three-dimensional. You can also experiment with adding different types of lines. And keep in mind, we're drawing rocks here, so you want the lines and the outlines of the rocks to be a little bit more jagged or a little bit more sharp than you would if you were drawing, say, a texture like grass or foliage of a tree. You can continue this pattern all the way up the little cliff face, ensuring that the bottom of each rock is shaded in using small up and down lines with your pen. You can see as we add more of these lines, it becomes clearer that this is a three-dimensional rock shape. Don't be afraid to draw short lines. You don't have to draw large or long, dark lines with your pen. I find it really effective to kind of sketch in the lines before I go back over them. You can see that the dominant lines outlining each of these rock shapes are jagged and a little bit darker. But then I'm adding in the cross hatching on each of the rock shapes on certain sides, giving the illusion of shading and shadow on some of the sides of the rock. And then it's the juxtaposition or the contrast between the shadow and the light that makes each rock appear three-dimensional. It can be great to experiment with adding really dark sections and really light sections and sections of shading in between. This is a great exercise as well to improve your hatching, because hatching is definitely a learned skill with ink drawing that can be difficult to master. However, we can't leave this waterfall river with only one side shaded in. Behind the top of the waterfall, I'm going to draw a background to kind of give us parameters in which to draw the other side of the waterfall. I'm bringing that background down to the right and then replicating some of these rock shapes on this side of the waterfall as well. However, you'll notice that on the right-hand side of the waterfall, the shadows are a little bit lighter and a little bit less detailed than the shadows nearest to us. This is because I think I want to experiment with giving the left-hand side a little bit more definition and contrast in sharpness. One, because it's closest to us, and two, because the waterfall itself might be emitting some mist, which might kind of eclipse or obscure the details on the far side of the waterfall. You can see how experimenting with the curved shape that's a little bit horizontal to the floor or to the bottom of your sketchbook can give us that either our right hand side of the waterfall, and it gives us a little bit of a stage to add some foliage and some vegetation to make it look like the waterfall is kind of falling into a lovely calm pool of water. You can see the different lines I'm using here to make it look like there's flowers or tall grass or maybe even trees behind us here on the waterfall. It can be really effective as well to experiment with layering in shapes behind one another to make it appear like the scene is kind of receding into the distance. This is a really effective and invaluable thing to add to your drawing, adding layers of detail, getting less detail as you go back into the page to make it appear like it's a three-dimensional space. As you kind of experiment with this and add details back into the page, you want to make them less detailed, less sharp, and less bright. When we see things far away, we kind of perceive them to be less detailed and also darker, or the colors get muddier. Now we're working with a black and white medium, but we can still take the principles of this into consideration. Adding foliage to your drawing can be a great way to contrast the harsh up and down or jagged shapes of the rocks. Adding short up and down, flowing and curved lines is how I create these little leaves, and you can really do as many as you want. Layering in foliage to a certain amount of detail is a really great way to contrast the rocks, the up and down, jagged and straight line shapes. Adding some shading around these shapes is a really key way of making them stand out even more. And you can see how adding shading behind the leaves is a great way to make them appear more bushy and more three-dimensional. For the grass down here, I'm focusing on short up and down lines. You don't need to add so much detail, and in fact, I often find artists can add too much detail to their pen drawings, especially when drawing larger textures like grass. If you consider the background of your drawing as something that's farther away from you, you want to make sure that it's less detailed. You can spend a little bit less time shading it in using that hatching method, and just ensuring that the front of your drawing kind of contrasts the back of your drawing. That being said, adding detail is the funnest part of pen drawing, I think. And so it's all about balancing where you put details to draw the viewer's eye. This is especially the case when drawing water. Water is so hard to draw. You can see here that I'm drawing these kind of rings emanating out from the bottom of the waterfall, almost like the water is plunging downward and then moving away from the waterfall itself. Often when artists draw water, they spend too much time or too much energy drawing in thick wave shapes that we think we would see. However, if you observe an actual waterfall or a little river, you'll notice that we don't perceive water in those wave shapes. Instead, drawing these horizontal kind of flowing lines can be a really great way to convey water texture without having to draw in the translucent material or transparent material itself. Water is so difficult to draw without color, I find, even with color. And so instead, it's about choosing where you're going to put detail. These horizontal lines I'm drawing with just the tip of the pen, and making them scratchy and inconsistent is a vital way of making the water appear a little bit more lifelike, adding some movement to it. You'll notice that I'm adding some shading using the hatching method around the waterfall itself, making the water that is off to the side appear a little bit darker than the water in the middle. This is kind of just to accent the waterfall and make it appear like perhaps it's emitting some mist, or that white water that occurs when water is kind of aerated or bubbly because it's under so much force and motion. This is especially the case when drawing the water on the waterfall itself, and I know I've said water so many times in the past 2 minutes, but I'm curving the water downward just by drawing a few vertical, long, inconsistent lines. Now, when you think about where light would hit the waterfall, as it's curving over the crest of the falls, it's going to be hitting the light, which means that that part of the waterfall is lightest, and that's why I'm leaving it blank. However, the face of the waterfall as well is not too dark, because as you know, if you observe waterfalls, the water kind of pouring over the sides often appears white or very light as it's kind of falling through air. However, in this case, the water is under a little bit of shadow, and I'm adding some really light hatching to further contrast that white crest of the water with the shadows on the other side. This is where individual style comes in. Developing your own style as an ink artist and drawing with ink is really critical in making art fun and unique to yourself. So I'd say do what appears right to you and experiment as well. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Art is all about making mistakes. And if we're too cautious in what we're drawing, we're never going to progress, or we're never going to discover new techniques or new methods of drawing objects or natural scenes that really connect with who you are and what you value as an artist. We have the bulk of our scene, and this is where you can really just add some fun little details as well to add some character, add some, some clues to the surroundings of what we're drawing. I often think of drawing as laying clues for the viewer. Each clue, like a tree or a rock or a waterfall or movement in the background, tells us a little bit more about where we are and how we should feel about the scene that we're looking at. I'm drawing a tree because I love trees, if you've seen any of my other videos, and a tree can often add a great sense of scale and place to a drawing. You'll notice when I'm drawing a tree or rocks or even this foliage here at the top of the waterfall, I'm kind of carrying that philosophy of light, squiggly lines wherever I go. You don't want straight lines because in nature, nothing is straight, where it's all kind of curved, elongated, and flowing. As you can see with that tree with the branches curving upwards and kind of squiggling into each other, if you look really closely, it doesn't look like anything. But when you zoom out, the tree appears to be three-dimensional. That's the joy of sketching, is by laying lines, and the lines appear a little bit hard to read or inconsequential, but when we look at the scene as a whole, we can see what we're trying to convey. It's kind of like when you talk about can't see the forest for the trees. Individual lines and individual shapes can distract us from creating an image that altogether, when taken all together, gives a beautiful glimpse into a natural scene that's real or imagined. I love thinking about the edges of my drawings as well. And you can see here on the left-hand side, I'm adding some grass, some flowing vegetation, and some shadows as I kind of fade out the scene. It's easy to imagine that there's more rocks to the left of this drawing, or to the right, or maybe even in front of us. But we don't have to draw them all. We're giving the illusion of more detail and the illusion of a three-dimensional space without having to add all those details in ourselves. I'd invite you, as you finish off this drawing, to think about where you can add more detail, where you can add more vegetation, where you can add more contrasting shapes, to really make the scene more dynamic and three-dimensional. You can see here I'm adding more and more vegetation as I go. That's a key way, I think, to make the scene appear lifelike, especially when drawing landscapes, because any natural scene, or at least in most natural scenes, there's an abundance of these small, almost imperceptible shapes like grass or shadows or cracks that we can add in. But as I mentioned before, it's being smart about where you add these shadows and lines as to not make your drawing appear overly crowded or, too dark. This is especially the case with the water that we talked about. And I'd invite you to, practice this as many times as you like, adding in the water shapes and making sure you start light and start with a sparse amount of lines before adding more and more. Always take a second to hold your drawing at arm's length as well, because that can be a great way of spotting areas that you can add more detail in, or perhaps refine the lines. It's by zooming out with your eyes that you can kind of identify gaps in the drawing that you've created. For me, I know I want to add more shadows to these rocks and more vegetation as well. And the tree, I think, appears a little lonely, so I'm adding the silhouettes of some trees beside it. And you'll notice that those cookie cutter trees that we drew in elementary school, up and down shapes, zigzag, zigzag, are not effective. They don't actually look like real trees in the wild. It's the squiggly, uneven shapes that really convey a sense of scale and depth and are way more interesting to draw as well. I think that if you start drawing trees like this, you might end up doodling them all over the place. I know I certainly do. Trees are so wonderful to draw because each one is individual and completely unique. And so it means that when we draw them as well, they're a lot easier to make appear lifelike because we're used to seeing a multitude or millions of different types of trees. And so if you draw one with strange branches or strange foliage, it likely will still appear lifelike, even though it has your own twist on it. Carrying these details down into the scene, we're almost done. And I like to kind of go back over my drawing and add in any more darker shading, make the shading a little bit more dynamic and contrasted to make the scene appear even more three-dimensional. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'd love to see what you create, and I'd love to hear from you about things I could do better or parts of this tutorial that you found especially helpful. Feel free to drop a comment, and I'd love it if you subscribed. Join my drawing community as we draw more 25-minute drawing lessons and just talk about art and life in general. Thanks for watching.